God, as we have gathered here in this place today to worship you, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our Lord, our strength, and our Redeemer. Amen. Okay, well, I've mentioned to you before that I had a really odd variety of part-time jobs when I was in college, when I was a younger man. I was one of those college kids that never quite could figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. And so I did a little bit of everything. Jack of all trades, master of none. That was my motto for a lot of years, especially in my young adult life. And I have to tell you that my younger brother was always very irritated by that, sometimes envious. He told me once, you know, you could stumble backwards through the wrong door of a building and come out on their payroll. And I did seem to have that sort of luck as a younger guy. My younger brother had to work hard to get the jobs that he had. Harder than I did anyway. So that stumbling backward through a door and coming out on their payroll, that did kind of happen to me in college. Actually, my senior year of high school. See, my last year of high school, the very last semester of high school, I took a public speaking class because it's something I thought I could do, and frankly, it was one of the only classes of that semester that did not require any written papers or final exams. Thought, why not? That's a great class to take. You know, that last semester of your senior year, that's not the time to burden yourself down with a heavy course load. By that point, my motivation had sailed. I was ready to be done with school. Senioritis, they call it. So I took a public speaking class. The final exam in that class was to read the school's daily announcements on the PA system. That's not a hard assignment for some people. I guess for some it is. Where I went to high school, I went to Alton High from Alton. At that time, there were 2,200 students enrolled in the school, and when you add in the faculty and the staff, that means about 2,500 people on campus. Reading announcements into a microphone doesn't sound like it would be hard until that microphone turns on and you realize there are 2,500 people listening to your voice in that moment, and then it's an entirely different kind of anxiety or stage fright that overcomes a person. Some of the kids in the class did the best they could just to make it through the announcements, and it was obvious that we were nervous when it was our turns, you know, and stammering over common words and long pauses and stuttering. And there was one kid in the class that even turned off the microphone and couldn't finish, just the nerves were too much. It is nerve-wracking to ask a kid to read something over the air, over an intercom to 2,500 people. I was nervous. I was very nervous. I decided to use my anxiety to have some fun. So when that microphone turned on, I thought, you know, I'm just going to pretend that I'm like a sports announcer or something. Good afternoon, Redbirds. Live from Vice Principal Bader's office. Here are this afternoon's announcements. And I even did a traffic report for the hallway outside the main office. I ad-libbed that. I couldn't tell if the vice principal wanted to wring my neck or laugh. Probably both. Mr. Ford, principals do that, right? Sometimes they just want to wring your neck, sometimes they laugh. But they can't show that they like it because, you know, they're principals. As I was doing the announcements, the school's art teacher, Mrs. Diener, was on the phone with her husband, who happened to be the news director at the campus radio station at SIUE. And he told her over the phone, go find that voice. So she did. Mrs. Diener tracked me down and said my husband would like you to go work for him over at the SIUE radio station. And in a couple of weeks after I did the announcements at school, I was on the radio. That time I really could use my radio voice for fun. And then it was, from the newsroom, I'm Rod Kerbach. You're listening to the jazz station of St. Louis, 88.7 FM, and I can still do that. And it's one of those jobs that my brother told me I fell into backwards, and I did. Didn't try for that. One of my favorite jobs at the radio station was occasionally filling in for the sports reporters. I don't know much about sports, I'll confess that. You know, that's a lot of guys my age are really into sports. I like watching a game every now and then, but I'm not one of those who memorizes player stats and all of that sort of stuff. Nevertheless, they gave me press credentials to the Cardinals and Blues games during the 2001 and 2002 seasons. So I had to pretend like I knew something about sports. During Cardinal season, I got to go down on the field during batting practice and interview players, talk to coaches, and then during the game sat up in the press box, and then after the game down to the clubhouse again to interview players and coaches. Sometimes I even asked questions. Most of the time I would wait for another reporter, like from KMOX, to ask the question, and then I would just pull my microphone out like I had asked it. My listeners didn't need to know. That 2001 season was kind of a neat one. St. Louis had a rookie first baseman that year. His name was Albert Pujols. Do you remember him? Yeah, a kid from Kansas City area. His English was so poor that no one wanted to interview him. Years later, boy, we all couldn't wait to talk to him. The Cardinals had a pitcher on staff that year named Woody Williams. He was one of the nicest guys in the clubhouse, and he actually talked to me. He knew that I didn't know much about sports, and that didn't bother him because he didn't want to talk about sports. During post-game interviews, he wanted to know where were the good fishing and hunting spots around St. Louis. He was the only Cardinals player I've ever known to wear a camouflage t-shirt under his jersey. Anyway, by the time the 2002 season rolled around, I had become a little more familiar with the ball players and the coaches, and they had become a little more familiar with me. I tell you this because that put me in an interesting spot. In 2002, I had a first-hand look at the grief and the sadness that fell over the Cardinals ball club when Jack Buck died. That was something that affected the entire organization. And then nobody could have known that only 4 days later, pitcher Darryl Kyle would have passed away in his hotel room in Chicago. And the team almost fell apart. The sadness, the anguish, the pain, and I mean pain, seeing grown men sobbing, baseball players sobbing because Jack Buck, a mentor, and Darryl Kyle, one of their peers, dying only 4 days apart. That's more than any group of athletes or coaches or human beings anywhere should have to endure. There was one player that emerged that year as sort of a big brother in the clubhouse. It was the team's catcher, Mike Matheny. Good guy. Anyway, I tell you all of that so that I can tell you that that's how I came to know Mike Shannon, Cardinals broadcaster, who's on the air sometimes, but not all the time now. Something I like about Mike Shannon, and say what you want about Mike Shannon, he's kind of, interesting to listen to at times, but he loves the team, he loves the city, he loves the game. If you really listen to him when he does a Cardinals broadcast, he always mentions something about the sky. Have you ever noticed that? Do you listen to the Cardinal games? This year it's fun because the fans in the stands never seem to boo. Still getting used to that. Mike Shannon always mentions something about the sky. During a lull in the game when there's not much activity happening, he'll talk about the sun shining from whichever side of the stadium, or if there are clouds or not, or the breeze. Or during night games, he'll talk about the stars that you can see beyond the stadium lights, or the moon, the position or the phase of the moon. Mike Shannon has this odd way of noticing what's going on in the sky, and he seems to talk about that quite a lot. That really has stuck with me about him. The reason I tell you all of that is because there is something special about the sky. There really is. It's one of the only parts of creation that we all experience together simultaneously, right? Think about this. No matter where you are on the planet, we may be drinking different water, we may be standing on different soil, we may even be on different continents, but when we look up, we are all looking at the exact same sky. No matter where you are on the planet, we're all under the same sky. That is the one part of creation that truly unites us no matter where we are. No matter where we live, no matter what we're doing, we're all under that same sky. So our reading from Jeremiah this morning, boy, that talks about the sky. It's not a good sky. It has a very ominous tone to it. At this point in the story, in Jeremiah's prophecy, Judah, people of Judah, the Israelite people, are about to be sieged by the Babylonians, and that's not going to go well for the Israelite people. Impending doom is on the horizon. You see, not long after the 4th chapter, where we were today in our reading, where we see Jeremiah today, not long after that, the Israelite people are in exile, running for their lives, and those are the ones that are lucky enough to get away from the Babylonians. And in the telling of this impending doom and destruction, the prophet Jeremiah uses this very doom and gloom type language. He talks about creation being undone, being wiped out, about God systematically undoing the creation that God had done back in the beginning, not completely erasing it, but pretty close. That's what Jeremiah describes. Everything beautiful, everything good about creation, completely undone and abandoned. Jeremiah talks about the earth being wiped clean, like a ghost town or a wasteland, an empty and a quiet and a lifeless sky. And there's one image in that prophecy that really sticks with me. The birds all fly away, and the sky is quiet and lifeless. That has a real spooky kind of aura to it. And this situation in Jeremiah's reading, in this point in the story where Jeremiah is giving this prophecy, the situation that Jeremiah is speaking to is not that uncommon for us. It's not truly that foreign of a concept. The people in Judah in that day and in that time, by and large, had forgotten about God. They had forgotten about God's teachings. They had ignored God's commandments to care for one another, to love one another. And there was a real issue where people were more concerned about themselves. Self-interest had become the way of life, rather than the virtues that arise out of living as godly people. Selfishness was the rule of law. It was a society where people watched out for their own needs and their own concerns, and they didn't really spend too much time worrying about how what they did affected other people. Jeremiah says this is not how God has taught us to live. It's not how God created us. It's not how God calls us to live. But it's still a way of life that infects us today. Can you imagine a society where there are people very wealthy and able to ease the burdens of others, but who choose not to because they would simply rather keep their wealth to themselves? That's one of the issues Jeremiah was dealing with in Judah. Can you imagine a culture where justice, being able to find justice in the legal system, is a very different experience for the wealthy who can afford legal representation, but for the poor who have to be at the mercy of the judge, their outcome in court is often very different. That's an issue we still wrestle with today. That's something that Judah was going through. That's something Jeremiah was talking about. Can you imagine a society where the three classes of people who are very important to God, the widows, the orphans, and the foreigners, are not provided aid or refuge, but instead are considered burdens or threats? That's an issue that Jeremiah was confronting in Judah. It's an issue that we still wrestle with today. These are the things, according to Jeremiah, that really displease God. When God created, including people, when God created us, God's desire is that we would watch over creation and take care of creation, including each other's needs, and that community-mindedness and compassion would be the driving force when we make decisions about how to interact with one another or with the world around us. Can you imagine a society where compassion and community-mindedness are set aside, perhaps in favor of things like rigid rule and law? This is a problem for Jeremiah. Jeremiah says God created us in his own image, an image of compassion and grace. And God expects us to act like it. And Jeremiah tells the people of Judah that if we don't do what God has created us to do, if we don't care for one another as God has designed us to do, then destruction is on the horizon. Self-inflicted destruction. Because we are created to take care of one another. And we are especially called to take care of those parts of creation that are vulnerable and unable to take care of themselves. That's something that perhaps the people in Jeremiah's day had forgotten. Perhaps people in our day have also overlooked this. So in either case, it's our job as God's children to not only follow God in praise and in prayer, to bow down before him, but to also make sure that we are serving the needs of others, watching out for the vulnerable. Vulnerable plant life, vulnerable waterways, vulnerable ecosystems that support life, but also vulnerable human beings among us. And if we fail to do this, if we fail to demonstrate godly compassion to one another, Jeremiah says that we can see a reversal of creation. This is what Jeremiah imagines in his mind. It's a creation that becomes undone, and it's at our own hands. Around the same time as Jeremiah, another prophet was proclaiming the exact same message. Ezekiel, in the 16th chapter of Ezekiel's book in the Old Testament, Ezekiel warns Jerusalem that their selfishness and their indifference would have dire consequences. In Ezekiel 16 and verse 48, God reminds us that this was the sin of Sodom. Remember that Old Testament city that God's judgment was cast upon. Ezekiel says this was the sin of Sodom, that she and her people were arrogant, they were self-absorbed, they were overfed, they were unconcerned about the needs of others, and they did not help the poor or the vulnerable. That was the sin of Sodom. So Jeremiah, our prophet that we read today, tells Judah how God will respond to our indifference and our lack of compassion and our lack of care for the more vulnerable parts of society. The sky is darkened, a dark and empty sky. The birds have fled, and what was once a beautiful creation will be left in ruin. But there's hope. In verse 27 of our reading today, there's hope, because Jeremiah says this vision is not final. It's a warning, and it's a very stern warning, but it's not final. The desired outcome for all of us who hear this prophecy is to become a community that pays attention to how our actions affect others, that pays attention to how we are or are not living as God has taught us in care of creation, in care of one another, and that we would return to God with humble and open hearts, ready and willing to serve. That's what Jeremiah desires for his people. It's what God desires for all of us. Our second reading today, the Psalm, bit of a contrast to the first reading. The psalmist today looks to the sky and sees God's handiwork. According to the psalmist that we read today, as we gaze into the sky, we can come to a deeper and more authentic understanding of God. We can grow in our relationship and grow closer to God just by gazing into the sky. Because when we gaze into the sky, we are seeing God's very handiwork. We're seeing something that there is no way we could ever create or reproduce on our own. When we gaze into the sky, when we listen to the sounds of creation echoing in the sky, we are hearing God at work. Because there's nothing any human could ever create that would even compare to the beauty of what God has done in nature. When we quiet our own voices, when we yield our self-interests, when we allow ourselves to see the movements of God in the world around us, like the rising of the sun, the setting of the sun, God's presence and love, they come close to us when we are able to step outside of ourselves and put ourselves in that moment in creation. Both of our readings today, both of our readings have this common theme that God speaks to us through the sky. We have a warning in Jeremiah, and we have a promise in our psalm. And in both cases, God uses the images of the sky to speak to us, to make his presence and his desire known to us. And when we pair these readings together from Jeremiah and the psalm, we kind of have this like Charles Dickens' Christmas story thing going on, the Christmas Carol, where we have Jeremiah's text being like the ghost of Christmas future, warning us of what could come, and then the psalm telling us we have an opportunity, we have a chance to save it all if we just realize that God is among us and calling us to be aware of his presence in creation, calling us to care for one another. And sometimes God works like this, right? Sometimes this is what God has to do. Sometimes God has to reach through decades of apathy or callousness or indifference to get our attention and to grab hold of us and to make us realize that if things don't change, our trajectory is not going to be a favorable one. Sometimes we have to hear words like what Jeremiah has to say to cause us to wake up and realize that we do have a responsibility and an obligation, a religious calling, a spiritual calling to care for the needs of the vulnerable around us. Sometimes we need to hear the words of the psalmist so that when we step outside and it's an especially humid day, rather than complain, oh my gosh, it's messing with my hair. Oh, by the way, it's never done that to me. No amount of humidity has ever messed with my hair. Sometimes we need to be reminded that when we step outside, we are stepping into that which God has created. There is no escaping God in creation. Malachi and Brenda had that conversation this morning. That pairs very nicely with our psalm today. There is no place we can go that we can be away from God's handiwork. So our calling today, our message today, is to pay attention to the needs of creation, to pay attention to what God has to say to us through creation. Because you better believe God speaks to us through the sky, God speaks to us through the land, God speaks to us through the creation around us. Maybe you've noticed, this is something that has always fascinated me, the ripples in a pond. If you throw a pebble into a pond, the ripples don't go just one way, do they? They go out every direction. And maybe that's what we need to hear today as we think of these two texts from Jeremiah and from the Psalm. Everything we do in our lives affects something or somebody somewhere. And sometimes those ripples go in a direction that we anticipate, but sometimes they go off in another direction that we hadn't thought of. And so our readings today cause us to be aware of how we interact with other people and with the world around us. Because God tells us through these readings that we have to pay attention to how creation responds around us. We have to pay attention to what the world needs, not just the physical world, but the people in it. This week's lesson is a challenge to be aware of things like the sky above us, and to recognize God's glory in the sky, but also to keep tucked back into our minds that the difference between Jeremiah's vision and the psalmist's vision lies with us. That's the only difference. The world being undone or the world praising God, that has to do with us. That's up to us. That has to do with how we interact with the world around us. So let us never forget that we have a big responsibility as people of faith, not just to praise and worship God on our own time and in our own way, but to serve God by serving others, by being aware of the needs of the world around us, the people around us, and by getting involved. And may we always, always be aware of our calling to care for the least of these in creation. Amen?
Amen.